Welcome to the Deep Dive Perspective. Today's show, we're going to deal with a topic which should be really alarming for anybody watching this show, especially if you happen to live in Britain and love the NHS. Because one of the things that you can't knock about Britain is the fact that we have a welfare state and we have the NHS, a service of medical help for all, which is really one of the most egalitarian achievements of, I guess, Western society, I would argue. Yet what we've seen over the last few decades is the methodical dismantling of the NHS, an attack, an assault, no less, by the privatization of that particular institution, by not only the complicity of government, but also, of course, big business. Now, what's going on? And why is it that there isn't a hue and cry? Who has voted in or suggested that the NHS should be undermined? Because that's what Dr. Bob Gill, who's in with me on the studio today, is going to argue, because Dr. Gill has spent the last decade campaigning against this kind of methodical and systematic undermining of the NHS. And I think without any further introduction from me, we're going to go straight into the interview. But do like, share and subscribe to the channel so that we can bring you more of these very eye-opening topics. Dr. Gill, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's
very kind of you to come in. And I was, quite frankly, flabbergasted when I saw your documentary. You've made two documentaries, but the Great NHS Heist is the one which seems to have captured more attention. Some very powerful contributors, Ken Loach and other very, very prominent people that I noticed on there, all basically outlining just how terrible the idea of breaking the NHS down is. And they interestingly compared it to the US model. And it seems as though since Margaret Thatcher, it seems as though it's been the clear intent of every government subsequently to go down that line of turning the British system into an American one, where actually people don't get free medical care and they struggle. In fact, the poorest struggle the most, obviously. So first of all, just your overview of what triggered you into, first of all, researching this and going as far as you have with this whole campaign?
Well, the trigger was really the loss of local services, hospital services. It was around 2010, 2012, we suffered the downgrading of my local hospital, where I sent most of my sick patients, Queen Mary's Hospital in Sidcup. And they closed the A&E department and they closed surgical and medical beds. And then there was a proposal to do the same to a hospital down the road, Lewisham Hospital. Now, South East London looks after 200,000 to 300,000 people. Already I'd noticed by that first downgrade that my patients were struggling to get access to acute medical care. And this struck me as dangerous and insane a proposal. So I started to ask myself, what's going on here? This doesn't make any sense. I got involved in the campaign to defend Lewisham Hospital, which was the hospital down the road. The A&E department was under threat, and the maternity unit. And what that means is people who are seriously ill in need of emergency medical or surgical care will have to travel further. And that can mean life or death. For every minute you're delayed in a critical situation, that increases your chances of dying. So that was the spear for me to try and find out what was actually going on, and then began, several years of mixing with similar-minded people who were also worried and doing some reading and meeting very bright people, health policy people. I realized this was a fight I needed to get involved in.
So when you began the campaign, the state of play was not as bad as it is today. I mean, 2015 sounds like when you must have begun this campaign, roughly.
No, it was earlier than that. It was around, there was a big act that went through, there was some public outcry, not very much, because the media do a good job of not telling us what's going on, in 2012. And that was the point at which I started to pay more attention to health policy. because what we see on the BBC and mainstream media is just a headline. It's just a marketing spiel. But actually the effect of policy has totally different to what we're presented on TV. And that's a deliberate way of dampening down public interest, providing some sort of fake reassurance, dressing everything up as reform. But they haven't reformed the NHS, they've destroyed it and repurposed it. And the NHS we have now, the basic principles have been extracted. The founding principles have been extracted. And what we're dealing with is a very dysfunctional system. The NHS we have now is not a system I want to defend, because it doesn't work for the patients anymore. It doesn't work for the professionals anymore. It is now really a sort of hybrid state of the US model and what we used to have in this country. Yet most people are totally unaware of it.
One of the shocking facts that came out in your documentary, and we will put up the link to that, to the documentary for people who want to watch it, because I really recommend people do take a look at what really is going on, because it's shocking. And one of the statistics that I think it was Frank Dobson, the late Frank Dobson, I believe, who came up with a fact check, which basically said that when the NHS was being run by essentially doctors and the traditional hospital management fraternity, they weren't. I think administration cost something like 2 or 3% of the entire budget. And I think at the time of your interview, whenever, I think it was 2019 perhaps when that interview was done, he was saying by that time the corporate management middlemen were now taking something like 15%, which was something like £10 billion more than the cost had been for doing it with the old school management. Now, that to me is mind-boggling, because in a time when we're supposed to be, we were pushed austerity by everybody from Tony Blair, Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair onwards. They've all been using austerity. Yet here we have waste, as not only the dismantling of the NHS, but actually public money being wasted on corporations. I mean, how's that come about?
Well, whenever a politician mentions efficiency, you have to assume he's going to deliver the opposite. All the way through the NHS reforms, they've been talking about efficiency. But what they had to do in the late 80s and early 90s was to introduce a management bureaucracy without which they could not marketize and commercialize the NHS. So they replaced a very small, necessary management administration, which was dominated by senior clinicians. They had to bring in the business sector. And this was led by Lord Griffiths, formerly the chair of Sainsbury. He came in and said, we're going to introduce market efficiency, and burdened the NHS with a huge bureaucracy. You had the creation of an internal market, a fake market within the NHS, whereby the GPs as purchasers would buy services from the hospital, but we're all working for the same organisation. So it didn't deliver, and it was never intended to deliver any efficiency. It was a way to bring in the ethos of buying and selling services. It was to normalise a market within healthcare, which would later become a compulsory external market. And meantime, this insanity becomes normalised within the clinicians. They think, well, the politicians must know what they're doing. Who am I to argue? I haven't got time to look into health policy. And you just go along. And by introducing this management layer, the other thing they achieved was to separate out clinical control, which laid with responsibility. If the doctors are running a system for which they are responsible, they have a professional buy-in to make sure that's the best system. But what the marketization did was removed power to the management class and left all the responsibility with the doctors and nurses. So they became a powerless. They're also trapped within this system that doesn't work for them. It doesn't respond to their needs. It doesn't alter service provision in a way that makes rational sense. Everything is very top down, and the doctors and nurses they appoint to management positions are selected on their ability to comply with top down orders. Because if you resist, you'll be got rid of. You wouldn't be selected in the first place, but if you managed to slip through the net, they would get rid of you.
What I'm shocked at is we live in a democracy. There have been several elections during the course of this period where this attack on the NHS has consecutively, concurrently been going on. Yet the public, even the politicians, and I'll come on to the media soon and their responsibility and culpability in all this, but the politicians, of course, have gone along with this hook, line and sinker. And it seems as though this is kind of a top-level scam and a con of the public. Because if you went to the public, Dr. Gill, and you said to them, look, we're going to undermine the NHS and we're going to get rid of free medical care for you, but we're going to do it by stealth and do it slowly, which is exactly what Keith Joseph and Oliver Letwin and Margaret Thatcher engineered back in the 70s and 80s. That's exactly what they did. They kind of realized that the NHS was really almost like a religious institution for many people now. It was a proud achievement, and rightly so. So to destroy it overnight would have caused an absolute political suicide for them. So they were resolved, literally. I mean, I've come across the papers where they literally say, we're going to do this slowly but surely. And it's Tony Blair and Gordon Brown who actually really made it go even faster. So it's almost like these politicians on all sides have been bought out by big corporations. Is that what, am I reading it wrong?
No, you're spot on. In fact, the documentation goes back to 1977. You had a group called the Economic Restructuring Group, which is part of the Conservative Party in opposition at that time. It was 2 years before Thatcher came to power, and it was chaired by Nicholas Ridley. And they set out in this document how they were going to privatize all the state industries, all the utilities, all the natural monopolies, with a special mention for the NHS to proceed by stealth and to break it up into separate profit centres. Now, 30, 40 years later, that is what the NHS is now. It's a broken up, decentralised morass of public-private partnerships where a huge expenditure is laid out on the management and the bureaucracy and all the costs of contracting out, as well as allowing for profit extraction. So there is a big black hole of money that we put in as taxpayers that is being siphoned away to provide profit and to pay for the army of bureaucrats, the army of management consultants, and the political class who will benefit from their dealings and their going along with this huge scam. The biggest betrayal of the public interest. And the reason they can't come out with it is because they have no economic argument. They have no argument because the NHS proved itself to be the most efficient model of delivering healthcare. Health is not a natural thing that lends itself to competition, because if you're a doctor and you have a patient in urgent need having a heart attack, they're not in a position to shop around for the best A&E department. So you have to have every A&E department fit to a certain standard. When you have private enterprise involved in healthcare, well, how do you know that that doctor, that surgeon is giving the advice that is right for you, or is the advice that they're going to make the most profit out of? If a surgeon offers you an operation to, let's say, amputate your toe, but he can earn more money if he amputates you above the knee, how do you know which operation is the best for you? So it introduces a perverse incentive between the doctor and patient to not necessarily act in the patient's best interest. It's hugely costly because of these administrative costs, and you have to extract a profit. And you mentioned Frank Dobson. He was never convinced of the privatisation model. In fact, he was the last health secretary under Tony Blair who believed in the NHS model. That's why they had to get rid of him. And they persuaded him to run for London Mayor. And he asked the private sector, what innovation has the private sector come up with that you think would help the NHS? And all they came up with, we can sell you and lease you a private scanner, which is on wheels. So he said, your definition of innovation is to give me a truck with a scanner on it. The private sector has nothing to add in healthcare except profit extraction and perverse interests for the clinicians.
I can't get my head around the idea of profiting from people's ailments and illnesses. That's just something which makes no sense whatsoever anyway. But let's give them the benefit of the doubt for a moment and say that, okay, they were thinking they were going to somehow make the NHS more efficient, and the politicians went along with that. But does the evidence say that any efficiency has been achieved? I mean, even if I was to give them the benefit of the doubt just for a second, has any efficiency been achieved?
So there's a good graph that's available online. It was produced by the OECD, the Organization of Economic Development, and it plots life expectancy with health expenditure. So as you spend more money on healthcare, what happens to life expectancy? Now, there's a pretty linear line for most of the developed world, where similar countries like Europe and America and other places, you're comparing all of these groups together. The more socialized the system, the more the linear graph upwards. The more you spend and you see a return in life expectancy. But as you look at the more privatized systems like the American system, you're spending more money, but the curve isn't rising. And in fact, life expectancy is lower than in the European average, right? And as we've started to spend more and more money in a more privatized system, we're not getting the life expectancy gain. So as a comparator, America spends at least double per head of population as the UK, but their life expectancy is several years less, right? Mm. Now, if that sounds like efficiency to you, then I wouldn't come to you for financial advice. That is the opposite of efficiency. Yeah. And if you look at the European models, which are a mixture, you've got state provision and funding, and then you have the private sector. Well, how is it efficient to have a system whereby you take in revenue through an already established tax system and then set up a parallel health insurance bureaucracy? So you paid for two bureaucracies. Now, how is that efficient? So it's nothing to do with efficiency. Please don't give these. The most benefit of doubt you could give to the political class is that they are ignorant and lazy. They haven't bothered to do the work, to research. I put it to you that most of them are ignorant, lazy, and corrupt. They're happy to benefit the private sector because they see politics not as a calling, but a job for a few years, after which they can go and work for the private sector, giving advice, or as in some cases, blatantly taking bribes, as some undercover TV reporting has uncovered. We saw Cash for Questions scandal, the appointment to certain people in the House of Lords. There is a revolving door between the sort of lobbying class and the political class. They go out of the lobbying industry, they end up in Parliament, they end up as a parliamentary advisor, they end up as an MP, they may even end up in the Lords, and then they're giving advice to their former employer. And a classic example of this toxic revolving door is one of the guys we featured in the documentary, a Mr. Simon Stevens, who first worked for the Blair government. He was a Labour minister, special advisor. Then he left the Blair-Brown administration. He went to work for United Health, which is America's biggest private insurer. Mm. He was there for 10 years, at the end of which he left as chief executive of the Global Expansion Unit. Now, there's a clue in that title, Global Expansion for an insurer. And at which point he came back to work for the NHS as chief executive of NHS England in 2014. And he spent the next 7 years reorganizing the background management and bureaucracy of the NHS, all ready for the last NHS Act that went through in 2022, which has basically rejigged the NHS into what's called the Health Management Organization model of the US, which is basically public funding going into an organization which is controlled by private corporations, and they maximize profit through the denial of care.
Just sticking with the politicians, because I'm going to come on to the guys who should be asking the questions, my profession, just in a moment. But just to finish this issue around political complicity with this dismantling and destruction and vandalism of the NHS. In the elections, did you see any of the mainstream parties put forward the kind of narratives or evidence that you found as part of their manifesto, as part of their pledge to maybe take on and challenge on behalf of the public those who are trying to destroy the NHS?
So what Tony Blair and Gordon Brown managed to achieve was to destroy, extract socialism out of the Labour Party. They removed Clause 4. That was a big step for them in their ideological direction. For a very brief period in the Corbyn administration, in the shadow government, was some talk for the first time in public of privatisation. And that was very encouraging to me. But this was one of the big reasons why the Corbyn project had to be destroyed. I was quite disappointed in some respects that, given the abundance of evidence that I outlined in the film, instead of using the grenades and the big bombs of evidence that I present, they were using a pea shooter about some sort of leaked dossier about coming into a trade deal with Donald Trump. Yet there was mountains of other very more powerful evidence that they could have used. So it was disappointing, but compared to what we had before, which was zero, I was grateful for small mercies.
Incredible, incredible. This is really shocking. I do like, share and subscribe, because it's exactly these kinds of narratives which leave me gobsmacked. And the reality is that as a relatively clued up journalist, if even I can't keep up with these kinds of what I can only call dangerous, destructive games of our rights and our social progress and our welfare progress in this society, then I dread to think what the ordinary punter on the street who doesn't even have time to pick up, read or go into these details is what kind of headspace they're in. If they're as ignorant as I've been on many of these issues, not that I haven't known about this destruction, I tend to go with my gut and on an intuitive level. Most people just say authority is fine and let's go along with it. But if we go along with this kind of thing, it seems to me that actually your health, your children's health, my health, it's all basically under attack. And if we can't be bothered to take care of our health, that is the fundamental thing that actually keeps life going, keeps families going, keeps our society going, then I think we're in real trouble. And that's just a reflection while we're talking about this topic, just how gobsmacked I am and how shocking this is. Now, the other...
Well, can I give you an example of... I didn't have my eyes as widely open as I do now. And one of the events that did open my eyes, and I can remember it very vividly, was in 2013. It was the political party conference season, and I got to know about a big demonstration against NHS privatisation in Manchester, where the Conservative Party were holding their conference. And this was on a Sunday, and you had the nation's media assembled at the conference centre there. And the march went past the conference centre, and you could see all the cameras on the second or third floor. And I thought, this is fantastic. There's 50,000 people here. This is one of the biggest demonstrations in Manchester's history. This is going to be all over the news, and I can get back to my life. I rang my wife. I said, don't go to sleep. News at 10 is going to be reporting this. There's a big movement against NHS privatisation. Can't wait to get home. Came back. Nothing. The most powerful tool our democracy has is the power of censorship by omission. You don't know what you don't know. And we are painted a picture which suits the political narrative, and we have three main parties that are basically the same. They're all neoliberal, and what I mean by neoliberal is they have no allegiance to the welfare state. Their main pillars are privatisation, reduce taxes for the rich, and deregulation. Deregulation means remove protections for the public. So that means you can pollute as much as you like. You don't have to guarantee basic services, and healthcare is one of the basic services that we have taken for granted, and we're at risk of sleepwalking into its loss. That's what's going on.
Well, more real cause for thought and reflection there, and I'm going to focus on that media now, because the politicians can't get away with things if the media is robust. Increasingly, of course, there's evidence to suggest that marriage between the lobby groups, which are representing private corporations and private interests of those corporations, the politicians who end up, as you said earlier, in cushy little jobs within those corporations potentially after they've been MPs. There's also the idea of backhanders, perhaps corruption while they're in office from these companies. But the third element is the media, because they should be watching all of this. And the corporations, unfortunately, also own all of those guys. So are we in a situation where the NHS has been stitched up by the media as well? You know, have they made documentaries on this? I mean, why was it that you had to make the documentary? Are there other media focus, products which people could go to? You'd have thought that Newsnight and all these guys would have been all over these sort of stories.
They have to handle it in a certain way, whereas it gives the appearance of robustly covering the issue. You get the reporting of waiting lists being 8 million or whatever it is now. You get the report of people struggling to get a bed after they've been to A&E and they need admission. So it comes across like the media care. But actually they don't spell out the underlying objective. So they can get away with this charade of holding politicians to account if the audience doesn't know what's going on. So they need that entrenched ignorance for their performance to work. And it's the performance. And it's a very regulated performance. And voices like mine are actively excluded. And I can give you several examples. So in 2016, you might remember there was the start of a junior doctor's dispute with government.
Yes.
They were having a contract basically imposed on them, which maintained the austerity-driven wage suppression and wage theft of the doctors. And by that time, I was quite networked into similar-minded activists. And they said, look, there's a program on the BBC, Victoria Derbyshire Live.
Yes.
Right? So I went along and met some good people. And what I discovered in this live program is they have people going around with their mics who do a quick pre-interview before they come to you live on air. And I found this out afterwards, but I had a suspicion I need to play it a bit canny. So they came to me and said, what do you want to talk about? I said, look, I'm a GP. I train other doctors. I'm worried about the effect on training. So eventually they came to me and I stood up and I said, look, the way the doctors are being treated is that they are a cost in this new privatized NHS. And that's the way you need to frame this debate. The government is cutting the costs of providing good healthcare ahead of corporate takeover because this is a profit stream for them. Now, this got a significant round of applause, probably I'm not showing off, but probably the best response from the concerned audience. Now, you being a journalist and getting a reaction like that and hearing maybe a controversial view, it should spike interest and more questions.
Yeah, continue. That would have been a line of questioning that you'd.
It was shut down. Shut down. No follow-up questions.
Well, I'll confirm your narrative. I've been on that Victoria Derbyshire show once by mistake. At the last minute, I was sent in just to verify that what you're saying is not an isolated case. They were talking about Syria, and they wanted a war on Syria. And the parliamentary Tory party's Mr. Rahman was on, beating the drums of war. And I was the only one who I think objected to the whole war narrative in a way which actually caused problems, rather like yourself, and I went controversial. I quoted the foreign minister of France, who had said very clearly that the British intelligence services had been 2 years prior to the Syrian so-called civil war, been involved in training the Syrian Ikhwan al-Muslimin to prepare to go in essentially for an insurgency. Now, that was an unpopular view. They didn't want that narrative. It was, again, as with you, shut down, no further questioning. It should have been the beginning of an entire core question about Britain's involvement, about creating the war there in the first place. Didn't happen. This is shocking, but when it comes to the health of, I mean, that's Syria. That's a foreign country. I can imagine why people may not be so concerned about that. When it comes to the media being accused of being complicit in dumbing down the dismantling of the NHS, not getting to the core of the issue, not investigating all the mechanics, that's a very damning allegation. I mean, is there more evidence of the media being complicit in this?
Well, I have plenty of personal evidence. The problem is, in order to discern the evidence, you've got to know what's going on, right? So if somebody has no awareness of the conflict in Syria and how the CIA's mission is to infiltrate other governments to make sure governments around the world are people they can control and bribe, and if they're not, they're destroyed. That is the story of the US hegemony, right? And unless you're open to that worldview or have any inkling of that worldview, you cannot reasonably critically assess what you're being told on the news. So that the success for the corporations in terms of stealing the NHS and sucking away tax money is to keep the public as ignorant as possible. And then as the service declines, say, look, this model doesn't work.
Well, that's what they did with the junior doctors. Weren't they accused of being lazy, basically? That they weren't doing weekends or some nonsense like that.
They also said it was more dangerous on the weekends. They fiddled the statistics. They smeared the junior doctors in order to push through a contract which meant that their wage suppression would continue indefinitely.
Tell me about the trades unions on this, because now I'm going to the other independent organizations. You'd have thought.
Well, I wouldn't say independent, but carry on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be with you on it.
Supposedly independent.
Yeah, I'm going to play devil's advocate. The trades unions are there, and they're looking at this privatization and the power of the corporations coming in, and they've also got interest quite often with the government because they were there, part of the Tony Blair 12 years or so. Again, that was their tenure overseeing this potentially. And then, of course, with Keir Starmer now, it's not much different, is it? I mean, have you seen any difference? And where are the trades unions in terms of their obligation to support their workers within the NHS and support their interests?
So, unfortunately, the elements of society, civic society, that are both supposed to provide a check and balance and fighting for the small man and fighting for basic rights, they have been captured, right? And you mentioned the Blair government. Well, in 2006, under Blair and Brown administration, Patricia Hewitt, the then health secretary, got the health unions into a room, Unite, Unison, GMB, and got them to agree to a partnership agreement called the Social Partnership Forum, because the unions were pushing back before they agreed to this. And she said, look, we're going to reform the NHS, but you have to promise not to resist. Now, I'm not sure what the unions were going to get in return, but essentially they bought their commitment not to rock the boat. Now, that Social Partnership Forum agreement was then re-signed in 2021, I believe, prior to the last act, or Health and Social Care Act, going through in 2022. The unions have been complicit. They have millions of pounds in the bank to launch a national campaign to raise awareness. They're not doing it. I have had several personal encounters with the unions, whereby you might have a local branch secretary very keen to hear what I've said, then arrange a meeting, only to find that meeting has been cancelled by higher up in the union. That happened to me in Unite. Other representative bodies like the Royal College of Nursing, they one of their local reps said, I want to hear you speak. I want you to speak to the whole membership. Let's get you in for a meeting. There was a pre-interview with a Scottish senior administrator of the RCN who found out the gist of what I wanted to say, and I was never invited to that meeting. So you've got to ask yourself, don't they believe what I'm saying, in which case you would have maybe want to scrutinize my evidence, or did they just not want their members to know what's going on? Because that's the only power that they have to be challenged by, is their membership. So it's essential for their membership to remain ignorant, and the leaders can do whatever they like.
So far, it seems to me that institutionally we have a full 360-degree, full-spectrum complicity in making sure that the NHS dies.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem to me as though anybody is really, other than forlorn voices like yours and maybe the activists who've gathered around you, are really pushing back. And I'm wondering about the staff and the doctors and the people there who obviously could be silenced because their salaries are on the line. If they were to speak up and fight back, what would happen to them?
Well, dissent is very difficult in a corporatized organization. First of all, in order to dissent, you have to know what's going on. Then you have to have the headspace to put in that extra effort to start rocking the boat. Now, most of the health professionals I know are pretty close to burnout. They're working in overstretched departments, understaffed, or haven't got the right staff because they're replacing qualified people with less qualified people. There's an active dumbing down problem going. It's firefighting because as the service degrades, there's more and more adverse incidents, avoidable serious damage to patients. Now, when you've invested your education and your career in a health service which is falling down around you and is systemic, where do you start? Right? And then within that institution, let's take a local general hospital. If you hear of what happened to a whistleblower within that institution, they would have been crushed. That complaint would go nowhere. Or they would see what happens when they do raise a concern. You have this system of adverse incident reporting, and when you report one adverse incident after another adverse incident after another adverse incident, and they all have a common cause and nothing changes, what are you going to do? Report and forever? Or are you going to think this institution isn't going to change? I'm just going to keep my head down and make sure I cover my backside and try and avoid any of these dangerous outcomes.
Let's get on to the patient now. What's the impact of all this as you've seen it unfold over those 10 years? How is the patient now within all this?
Okay, so the average patient experience now is, first of all, you might have suffered the closure of your A&E department, so you have to travel further to an A&E department or a maternity unit. When you get there, you're going to have overwhelmed staff, long waiting times in crowded A&E departments, nobody knowing who's the sickest amongst the crowd of people sitting there. Maybe half the crowd is made up of people who can't get an appointment to see their GP. Then you have the prospect of somebody seriously sick, needing a hospital bed, waiting in a corridor, unsupervised, potentially a 1 in 80 chance, 1 in 80 of a seriously sick person in those circumstances dying. Now we know there are tens of thousands of people fitting that description, waiting more than 12 hours for a bed, having been diagnosed with a serious illness which requires specialist attention on a ward, dedicated ward like a cardiology ward or a surgical ward. But they're there languishing in a corridor, which is now called corridor care. It's been normalized. And you have corridor nurses, right? Running up and down crowded corridors, making sure the drips haven't run out. So we have like a war zone scenario if you're unlucky enough to need the attention of an A&E department. What happens when you go to see your GP? Well, who is your GP? that relationship between the patient and the doctor has been smashed apart. And the GPs have inadvertently colluded with this because they have been manipulated by financial incentives to destroy their own service. You couldn't make it up. And I've written about this. Over time, more and more financial incentives have been introduced which break continuity of care and make everything very prescriptive in terms of get them on a statin or do this to the patient, right? Which you could argue some of it is in the patient's interest, yeah? But then you've actually refocused the doctor's attention. So no longer is it individualized care with your GP who's known you for years. You're just on a conveyor belt of seeing different people at a different time. You may not now even see a doctor because people are coming to the surgery and seeing somebody they think is a doctor, but is actually a physician's associate. Yeah? And the General Medical Council, which was set up to prevent quacks pretending to be doctors, is now providing cover for PAs because they say we will be the regulator for physicians' associates who aren't doctors. They've done 2 years training instead of 10 years training. They're saying we will regulate them. Now, what does that create? A perception in the public's mind that these are equivalent. So the government have played a very clever trick. Remember I said to you, neoliberalism is about deregulation.
Yes.
Well, they've deregulated by using a regulator to provide cover for this de-skilled workforce. Yeah. So the NHS doesn't exist anymore in its original form. You do not have a well-equipped district general hospital everywhere. You do not have the next level up of tertiary centres of excellence where the more complex patients go, networked into their local district general hospital. And you don't have a local GP with whom you and your family have a relationship, right?
Yes.
And you have millions of people who are denied care through the very fact that they're on a waiting list. And you have other people who are denied life-saving care because they've died waiting on a trolley. Yeah? So you have denial of care, you have loss of continuity, and you have a dysfunctional system which seems totally insulated from any accountability. Yeah? And now we've heard maternity scandal after maternity scandal where you've got preventable deaths of newborn, young children, neonates, deaths in pregnancy, deaths of mothers, one unit after the other. The most recent in Nottingham. Before that, you had it in Shrewsbury. Before that, you had it in Margate. Yeah? The NHS can no longer provide safe care for mothers and babies at the most critical time. And where's the accountability? Where are the managers and the chief executives getting sacked? They're not sacked. They're not accountable. They're moved elsewhere. If they've done a good job of covering up, they're promoted. Now, I've got very long experience of a well-known whistleblower in the NHS, a Dr. Chris Day. You can look him up. He's been battling a whistleblowing case for 10 years. The government has spent in excess of £1 million shutting him up. And what was his problem? He happened to report the preventable death of people on an intensive care unit which was understaffed, had twice the number of patients to doctor ratio than it should do. And he raised the alarm, and the trust, Queen Elizabeth's Hospital in Woolwich, decided to crush him. And they've spent millions of taxpayer money destroying him. And in the process, what they did, by denying that he had employment status with the training authority that trains doctors, by denying him that legal right, they removed the legal right of 54,000 junior doctors in the country from whistleblowing protection. Whistleblowing protection, by the way, which is pathetic, but they removed it altogether. Now that's what corporatized NHS is very busy doing at great expense, is covering up disasters, making sure there's an atmosphere of silence within the corporation, and keeping the doctors busy just managing and skewing their performance with financial incentives, which will move towards financial incentives, for example, for me not referring my patients who need surgery. That's where it's going, and that's what the American model does.
I'll come on to where we're going as a conclusion, but you've triggered in my mind one of the bits of research that came up in your documentary, The Great NHS Heist, which I recommend everybody watches. And it was that when the NHS was about to be announced and people found out that it was going to happen, the suicide rates dropped. Because those people who thought they didn't want to be a burden on their families actually stopped taking their own lives because they suddenly found there was an NHS system which meant that they would get cared for and it wouldn't be a burden on their families after all. That was just the pre-impact of the NHS arriving. And then when it did arrive, you talked about mothers and children and the mortality rates. There's a clear huge, exponential curve of the saving of babies and from certain kinds of death, and there was a reduction of those deaths. So we all know the benefits of a good traditional NHS service, National Health Service. That's there on evidence. It seems as though rather wicked people have committed to destroying that very, very brilliant, achievement of the welfare state, of the British people, of the British government at that time. And they're doing it with absolute callous disregard to life. I've seen that now we're also emerging with this business about making it normal for people to be assisted with death. In a privatized, corporatized, money-orientated National Health Service, one would imagine that it's in their interest to get rid of people who are costing them money because they're just lingering around in this life a little too long. So how long before people are assisted with death or encouraged to die because it'll save money? I mean, I'm not sure whether we're already there. These are all questions coming up in my mind, and that could be something that we could explore in further programs. So I'm sure one program isn't enough, and we've nearly come to the end.
Well, just to touch on this point, it's not about saving money. It's not about saving money. It's whether that person's continued existence can generate profit.
Wow.
Right? So, are they on very expensive chemotherapy for a cancer? Keep them alive, right? Because Big Pharma wants to take their cut.
Yeah.
Are they in a nursing home, languishing, close to death, maybe, but in their terminal phase of life, but requiring very much intense nursing care? Now, what's the effect of profit for that person? They become a unprofitable patient. So they will be a good candidate for assisted suicide. Whereas the other person who may be mildly demented but can look after themselves, hardly any nursing care, can clean and toilet themselves, well, we'll keep them in the private equity owned nursing home because they cost less than the money they generate, either through government or from selling off their asset, the house. Yeah? So it's when people become unprofitable that assisted suicide will be on the agenda. Perhaps, as we've seen in Canada, people who are depressed because they're in debt, they're being offered assisted suicide.
Yeah.
Well, hypothetically, if you've got a young person with a good set of organs, maybe you offer them a kidney donation before they assist in their own suicide. So I'm not exaggerating when I describe what the money people want. And an example of this is what happens in America, whereby students who are struggling to pay their student loan, they have set up blood and plasma donation units. And they advertise to the students, come and give your blood, come and give your plasma. We don't care if we make you anemic or hypovolemic and you faint, because there's cash in it for you. And you need it because the other part of the neoliberal, extremist, capitalist system has put you in debt when we never used to put our students in debt. So there's a profit angle to a lot of these policies, and it's being discussed in Parliament at the moment. And it would be a very dangerous step if it becomes law.
Well, that supplements a narrative which I've been familiar with, the notion of Malthusian depopulation agendas, useless eaters, people who are unnecessary and not productive, not beneficial for a neoliberal hyper-capitalist system. And that makes it even scarier that actually they want to make money out of people who are dying, but in a certain way, which is really bizarre and shocking. It's been shock after shock, this program, and I thank you for opening these chapters, because they all need to be addressed in more detail, and hopefully in this show we'll have you back to talk about more of the things that I wasn't able to get into depth on. But you talked about the American system, and I want to conclude with painting a picture of where we will be in 10 years' time if this trajectory that we're on continues, because America does seem to be one of the spaces, and there's no medical care that's guaranteed to the poor and the people who are at the bottom of the rung, let alone people who are reasonably well off. Where do you see Britain or many institutions in Europe if they continue along this erasure of national healthcare as we knew it?
So you will have a group of patients, a certain proportion of the population, who cannot access high quality care that they need in a timely manner. So waiting lists is one way of doing that. Closing down local services is another way of doing that. Substituting qualified professionals with less qualified professionals is a way of doing that. So the quality will diminish. You will have a middle class flight out of the system, who see that the NHS is getting more and more unpredictable and dangerous, and they think they will be providing themselves with an insurance policy, literally, some protection, additional protection for when they're ill. But that's not how insurance works. Insurance works by assessing your premium based on how much you cost them the year before, right? So most of the people going bankrupt through medical expenses in America are those with insurance. Yeah?
Right.
75% of the household bankruptcies are through healthcare, and the majority of those are the insured. So the middle class in the UK, in England, need to wake up, because insurance is going to price you out when you get your cancer or when you need your complex surgery. There was an example of this published in the Sunday Times, October 2022, of a King's Counsel, a Mr. James Guthrie, whose Bupa premium went from, I believe it was 6,000 to 160,000 per year. Now, if you think you're going to be able to afford that rise, carry on, keep your eyes closed and your mouth shut, and don't worry about what happens to healthcare. And you will get more and more. You heard about the assassination of the United Health executive in America. One of the reasons postulated for that crime was the introduction of an algorithm which decided who would be getting care in the American system. Well, there's nothing stopping these algorithms being introduced in the UK and taking out the human decision maker.
Crikey. Well, absolutely fascinating and really frightening picture that we've had. What do you want the public to do? Those who are watching, our audience now, what do you want them to do? What can we do to avert this disaster?
Watch the film, share the film, educate your immediate network, your family. If you're in a civic organization or a union, start asking questions about your leaders. If you're in a health union, there's a lot of questions you need to be asking about what your leaders are doing. If you're in a political party, you need to wake up. The political parties, all three main parties and Reform, represent global financial interests. They do not represent you. What we're served up is a narrative that sounds like it might represent our interests, but look at the last 40 years. Living standards have declined, wages have declined, people are priced out of the housing market, social housing is non-existent. So everything we benefited from the end of the war to the 70s, that welfare state is disappearing fast, and what's left of it is there, the public funded elements of it is there for the private sector to cream the money away from. So we're entering into a very corrupt and fraudulent system, and unless there is a critical mass of people who can start spotting the lies and substitute hope with information and knowledge, because it's very easy for us, as you said right at the beginning, we naturally trust authority. We have to smash that natural bias. Authority has sold us down the river time and time again, be it in domestic policy, be it international affairs, be it Starmer threatening war with Russia. We need to wake up.
So where can they find you? Where can they find the movement which is actually taking on this challenge?
So there are a few organisations. I'm mainly on Twitter. My handle is @DrBobGill. There are some resources linked to the film. There's a website, the Great NHS Heist.com. The video is available free on YouTube. Just go to search the title. There are a couple of organisations that are doing a bit of good work. One of them is Every Doctor, which is despite the title, it's a public forum which is raising concern about all these issues. And they're not serving some other interest. Yeah. So you're going to get pretty unbiased stuff there. So, if you follow my Twitter stream, you'll get to know a lot more useful content.
Well, Dr. Bob Gill, I'm ingratiated. I'm grateful for your coming in and for educating us on such an important issue. And I'm sure we're going to have a chance to maybe invite you back and other people who are in this campaign. And you'll certainly have our platform to be able to alert people further. Thank you for coming in. And that's all we have time for on this edition. Real eye-opening stuff. And I would recommend you go and follow up those leads which Dr. Bob Gill has outlined, and get reading and really get familiar with this issue and get campaigning, because your kids' lives are at stake. Your grandparents or others may be too late for them given the way things are going, but it's not too late for us to avert the disaster that seems to be imminent over the next 10 years or so, and I think we're all duty bound to do it. Thank you for watching this edition of the Deep Dive Perspective. Do like, share and subscribe so we can get this out to as many people as possible, because it's absolutely vital that these issues are heard far and wide. Thank you. Goodbye.